All right. Hello, everyone. As you're joining here, thanks for coming. This is the Brooklyn Rail's 575th New Social Environment. I'm Carolyn, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the real pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Audrey Flack and Jason Rosenfeld on the event of Audrey's show, Force of Nature, on view at Hollis Taggart through June 24th. We are thrilled to welcome poet Elizabeth Lothian here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check the chat for a living document of some resources and actions. Today's conversation will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel where you can view the full archive of the series. And with that, I'll introduce today's guest and host. Acclaimed painter and sculptor Audrey Flack is a pioneer of photorealism and the first photorealist painter whose work was purchased by the Museum of Modern Art for its permanent collection. Among many major museums around the world, her work also resides in the Met and the Guggenheim. Flack has taught and lectured extensively both nationally and internationally and was awarded the Augustus St. Gaudens Medal from Cooper Union, among many other awards and recognitions. Flack is the author of 3 books and is currently writing a sequel to Art and Soul, as well as a memoir. Distinguished Chair and Professor of Art History at Marymount Manhattan College, Jason Rosen, Ph.D., has curated the exhibitions John Everett Millais at the Tate Britain and Van Gogh Museum, Pre-Raphaelites, Victorian Avant-Garde, also Tate Britain and the National Gallery of Art, and River Crossings at Olana and Cedar Grove. He is co-author of the monograph Cecily Brown and a senior writer and editor at large for the Brooklyn Rail. Thank you all again so much for joining. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Jason.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Great to be here. Again, our 575th NSE since March of 2020. And those of you who tune in frequently know I'm a big baseball fan, and the Phillies have won their last 4 games. And that puts us in the home run chart between Harmon Killebrew with 573 home runs, and we're approaching Mark McGwire with his steroid-fueled 583 home runs. We're getting there. But welcome, Audrey. It's great to have you here. You're coming to us live from the Upper West Side, am I correct?
Yes. 83rd Street, Riverside Drive.
83rd Riverside, beautiful sunset views, good light, and a lot of art coming out of there, as I understand it. I'm coming to you from the West Village, and we're excited to have this conversation today. Thanks to Fong and Nick and Carolyn at the Rail for all your work in getting this together. I want to thank Severin in Audrey's studio, who has been indispensable in helping us to make this happen. I want to thank Cara and Deborah and Cassie and Hollis at Hollis Taggart for helping out with imagery, catalog. There's a good catalog for the show that is up right now, which we'll talk about, Force of Nature. You can go see it on West 26th Street. And also Elizabeth, who will be our poet and will be speaking later. So it's great to be here today. I'm going to start the screen share. The customary title page. So here's the show. It's at 521 West 26th Street. It's up for another couple weeks, closes on the 24th of June, 24th of this month. So get there as you can. It has a catalog with an essay here by Samantha Baskind, and it is comprised of works that we'll talk about, some found in a box or some such thing, a variety of different works. I'll show you a few installation views. Here is a shot with a self-portrait, which we'll talk about a little bit later on the left, and then a suite of works, some of which are oil, some of which are watercolors, which you see on the north wall there, and then the larger view of the gallery. Just nice installation on white walls. So there are a number of works, nicely framed. There's the centerpiece couple of oil paintings. We'll talk about some of these a little bit as we go. And just to point out, that this is, I believe, your third show at Hollis Taggart. Is that right, Audrey?
I think so, yes.
I think so, yeah. So there was an earlier show on the abstract expressionist years that Hollis hosted in 2015, and then a show on master drawings from Crivelli to Pollock in 2017. So this is the latest iteration. So is it true, the story, that these works were discovered in a dusty attic, Stranger Things style, in a box, having not been seen since 1953 or something?
Well, almost correct. My Severin, God bless Severin, found them in the bottom drawer of my flat file.
Okay.
Away and took them out and said, "What are these?" And that's what they are.
Okay.
So I had not seen them since I made them. The paintings were different. The two paintings were stuck in my storage closet. But they go back to what, 1950? 48.
48, yeah, a little earlier.
Kind of long before any of you were born. Cannot believe how old I am, Jason. Shocking. It's
yeah. How old are you, by the way? Happy birthday! You had a recent birthday.
91.
91. So that's into your 10th decade.
Oh,
magnificent! God. Everybody, give it up! Magnificent. You are not the first nonagenarian that I have interviewed for the Brooklyn Rail. I talked to Phil Pearlstein. I talked to Wayne, Amanda, and I talked to Wayne Thibault. So this is a consistent thing.
I love both of them, and Phil and I. Phil lived on the Upper West Side, and Phil and I used to draw together all the time.
Right? Yes, I know, you're right near each other, and it's a similar kind of bucking the trend sensibility of figuration in a moment of high modernism, supposed high modernism, which we'll talk about.
We really did. We really broke, and it was not easy.
Yeah, anyhow. I know, and it sounds like it, and it's really a fascinating story, which I encourage people to seek out a little bit further. But that idea of arriving on the scene in the 1940s, a little bit younger than the generation covered in Mary Gabriel's great book, 9th Street Women, which I hope many of you have read. Just a little bit younger than the generation of artists who are closely associated with the ABEX movement. But in the midst, in the same milieu, very much concretely so, and studying, of course, in New York at Cooper in 1951, and then with a short stint at Yale, at the Yale working under Joseph Albers. And then you went to the IFA. Now I'm intrigued by that because I'm a graduate of the Institute of Fine Arts. This is the New York University Institute of Fine Arts, which is the art history, archaeology, and now conservation and curatorial studies program, postgraduate program at NYU, which is housed in the James Duke Mansion on 78th Street and 5th Avenue. But I didn't realize that you'd gone there. What were you studying there, and who were you working with?
Well, Krautheimer.
Okay. And the legend
who memorized things. And I took Romanesque sculpture, and I took a course on Velázquez. And I thought maybe I would, earn a living teaching art history, but you guys are so brilliant. I'm a painter, and I love art history, but I couldn't. I mean, how long did it take you to get a doctorate?
Don't ask. And if my parents are on, they don't want to hear it. No, it took me. It took me 9.5 years. 9.5 years to get MA and PhD, and I was teaching at NYU a lot of it until they finally told me. Carol Krinsky told me, Jason, go finish your dissertation. You need to move on. We love having you teaching here, but you got to finish. Yeah, so 9.5 years. Nowadays, it's a little shorter, maybe 7.5 to get through.
Jason, just
too long.
Too long. The 9th Street Women. I was the same age as Ruth Kligman,
Right.
and maybe a year or two difference, Helen and me. And
Okay.
Grace and I were really, and my memoir, which is going to be really interesting. It's coming out next year, and it
Yeah.
deals a lot with what really, really happened then. What really happened with these women and men. So, because I was,
It doesn't gloss over it.
no,
Yeah. Good. I mean, you're slighted in this book, I believe, to a degree, because you're only really mentioned once, and really in the context of Ruth Kligman and introducing her to Jackson Pollock, which seems kind of ridiculous. But you know, part of our job as art historians is to open up the conversation, and of course, memoirs like the one that you're preparing will help to do that. So you didn't spend a lot of time at the Institute of Fine Arts, it sounds like, just a few classes.
No, it was a year or maybe two.
A year. Okay. But did they ever take you to the museum to see the Velázquez's, or was everything done with black and white lantern slides in the classroom?
Lantern slides, you know, that was
amazing. I caught the tail end of that. Professors who would be at the top of the front of the classroom, they would bang on the lectern to have someone change the lantern slide manually, change these big slides for these sort of cruddy black and white images. But I guess, you know, it was enough to see the stuff. But it got you interested in Spanish art, clearly.
Well, what got me interested in Spanish Baroque was growing up in Washington Heights, living near the Hispanic Museum. And I was there by myself when I was a kid. And I mean, look, I think we all have something inside of us that guides us towards what we inherently love. Like, love John Everett Millais. You know, I love John Everett Millais, but I fell in love with Louisa Roldan. I didn't even know her name. I fell in love with these over passionate, gorgeous carvings with bleeding Jesuses and saints, and I just fell in love with them. And then I took a course at Yale called Iconography of the Bible, and it just it's been with me ever since. But it's a period that's been slighted. It's been left out of art history, and it's been ridiculed because it was not refined. You know, it's not Raphael. It's passion art with you know, my Macarenas with the tears pouring down. And that is supposed to be bad taste. So a lot of my work was labeled bad taste. As a matter of fact, Rob's store was very funny because what does he say? My work defies good taste. I mean, he said it in a complimentary way, but what is good taste? Is good taste for 300 elegant collectors who live on Park Avenue who have to have a minimalist? Is that good taste? So so much has to be questioned.
There's a lot to unpack there, and it's all really important, I think. And your connection with your neighborhood, with the Hispanic Society Museum and Library up on 155th Street, Audubon Terrace. If those of you in the audience haven't been there yet, you must go there. It's incredible. There's sculpture, polychromy, painted wooden statuary. There's amazing Soroyas, Goya, Velázquez, etc. It's an incredible treasure that's sort of undervalued, and there's exceptional Dominican food all around there in that neighborhood. So I recommend that. And that idea that, you know, your taste is formed by what you experienced growing up, and also your level of openness of mind. I totally sympathize as someone who somehow got connected with the Pre-Raphaelites in my academic career and made it my mission to kind of bring them up in estimations. I'm hoping we'll talk about that a little bit later, but it certainly informs the way that you've pursued, your interest in art, whether it's in the pop Baroque or in your sculpture. So the early things, just to come back for a couple minutes, the early things in the show, I just want to show some people. And I've given the titles in this slide presentation. And if there's no medium, that means it's oil on canvas. So this one, Magic Hour, 1948 to 49, oil painting, panoramic format, sort of an abstract landscape. In my reading, a kind of melange of, feels like early American modernism and also German expressionism layered into there. And, you know, kind of active brushwork. Here's a detail on the surface on a, you know, visible canvas underneath. Feels like very dry brushwork in these kind of early oil paintings.
Yep.
Or a work like this one, Gloriosa Bridge from 1948-49.
Yes.
You want to say a few words about how you were dealing with oil paints in this period?
Well, what was happening is that I always wanted to draw like an old master. I loved the old masters. That was knocked out of me because everything at that time was Picasso, Braque, Juan Gris, and abstraction. And you just couldn't do anything else. You couldn't see anything else. Realism was out. It was really severe. And that was happening in school. So it was interesting that I was doing some direct vision and going back to the Fauves and German. I love Beckmann and, you know, again, these were kind of independent paintings that I was doing, and that led into Abex. The minute I get into Cooper, I'm hanging around with all those guys.
Right, right, at Cooper Union.
Yeah.
And this is a little bit in the early, right before that. And here on the right is the Andre Durand Fauves painting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
After that,
yeah, I mean,
I'm an abstract expressionist because everything was knocked out. Abstract expressionism took over, and it was the most exciting thing that ever happened. So, go ahead.
But the early stuff seems to me, you know, that it's sort of 1 foot kind of in each camp. I mean, I'm fascinated by these early paintings, which are at the show. This one, which is a watercolor here on the left. And I mean, it calls up many different things in my art historical mind, not just El Greco, which you see on the right, but which is in the Metz collection, of course, but also Martin Johnson Heade, pictures like that, sort of those moody American landscapes.
I love him.
Martin Johnson Heade, right?
I did a photorealist painting of one of his called.
Yeah.
Anyhow.
Yeah, no, Martin Johnson Heade. I mean, when I read stuff about you, people always go back to the sort of card-carrying modernist artist when they're trying to make connections. And I think I appreciate the fact that your vision was very broad when you were living, you know, in New York. You were clearly taking advantage of all the cultural institutions and thinking with your eyes and with your, you know, sensibilities instead of just what was trendy. That's what it feels like, you know, to me. Because certainly Martin Johnson Heade in 1950 was not trendy. Was not trendy. I'm not sure he is today, but was not trendy.
That's an interesting comparison you're making with the El Greco.
Well, it has you're using this cracking sky up above, and I love also how the reflection in the water is not the same sky. That's a extraordinary sort of you know, occlusion in a way of the weather effects above. Here's one of these really kind of fun pencil works, 1951. There are a couple of these works in the show with a lot of experimentation with geometry and also profiles of bodies and faces. It calls to mind a lot of other different artists and sort of experimentation.
Gorky, but form is developing, you know, the background, the white, I like this piece.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I have a detail to show everybody.
And it's
there's a little smudging going on with the charcoal.
Yeah, and de Kooning is doing that too. You know.
Yeah.
He's beginning.
And Gorky, especially with these sort of open-ended forms that bleed out into the rest of the composition.
Yeah. There was a Gorky show as I used to walk across 8th Street to Cooper, and the old Whitney was there. Whitney. It knocked my socks off. Gorky.
Yeah. And Gorky still seems to be able to say a lot to us. My students always gravitate towards his work when I'm teaching the New York School and abstract expressionism. It seems like something you could kind of really connect with emotionally in a way that maybe you can't with some of the other painters. Here's a work that is literally titled Abstract Expressionist, Autumn Sketch, 1953, where it's sort of a combination of the works we've been looking at.
Well, it's up in the sky, and Pollock, while he worked on the floor, was out of galaxies. He was up in the sky. And so a lot of my Abex work from that time is up in the sky, and all of it, the picture plane is tilted up, and he punctures. I could go on for hours about Pollock. I think he's an amazing artist, not a painter. He's not a painter. He doesn't like.
In what sense? Go ahead.
He doesn't enjoy pushing paint on the canvas with a brush. He doesn't enjoy that sensation that de Kooning enjoys, that Klein enjoys, that I enjoy. He bypasses that, and he breaks. That's the greatness. I mean, he's a shaman. He breaks through to another dimension, and he gets lost, unfortunately. But he's in outer space, and so space. You can see that these things are up in the sky while it's called autumns, but it's autumn sky. Anyhow, he's wandering around in the universe, and creates a whole other dimension for art. But that's why he's working on the floor too. I think it's
right.
Anyhow.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting to think about it that way. I mean, there's a removal in his art because he removes the brush, right? He turns it around, he pours the paint, he drips the paint, he separates himself from the canvas. I mean, if you think of someone, you just said de Kooning, I think of someone now like Oscar Murillo. There's a great show of Oscar Murillo works at David's Werner, which Phyllis Tuckman, I think she's here today, reviewed for the Brooklyn Rail. And that's an artist who's really interested in the gesture, the hand, the thick paint stick, the brush, getting into it, like de Kooning, like Klein. And that idea of removing yourself and making it somehow more atmospheric is quite interesting, I think. And you talk in some other interviews about flinging paint 40 feet across the studio and making, maybe not this one, but in some works from this period. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. And I think these days, whether you call it second or third or fourth generation Abex, there's a lot of that smeary, thick, viscous delight in paint.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening. Many artists are doing that.
Yeah. I mean, I worked with Cecily Brown, and actually some of your early work reminds me a lot of what, she does in her paintings, but it's a sheer delight in working with pigments on the surface, and with your hand, with the actual hand, and not at a kind of remove.
There's so much here, right now, I'm in love with Dürer and Dürer's woodcuts, and now I'm in love with line.
Yeah.
So, where do you go? You go from schmear to line?
Schmear to line. It sounds like something you order at Zabar. But here, related to that, I think there's an evolution from this kind of work. So on the left are a quartet of watercolors that are in the show that Audrey did in 1954. And I'm just going to put up a couple watercolors, which are my favorite watercolors on the planet. And I hope you will respond to them. So this was in MoMA's show of watercolors, which we had last year. Cezanne's Green Melon. So, working with watercolor, I think it feels to me that that was a inceptive element in your early training, that it informs everything you're still doing.
Well, watercolor is a very intimate way of working for the artist. It's not, you're not making a huge statement, you're not pushing paint around on a big canvas. It's different than gouache. Watercolor is an intimate part of a relationship between the artist and herself and himself. You're doing it because you got to do it and because you love it, and you're not thinking, hey, I'm going to make this big thing, it's going to sell. It's a watercolor, and there's something really special about it. And it's not going to knock anybody's socks off like a big, de Kooning woman. You don't even think that way when you do it. You just get into it, and you're in it for the line and the color and the wash, and it's kind of a delicate, intimate, beautiful relationship with yourself.
Is there a kind of baked in indeterminacy which really appeals to you?
Oh yeah. You just right there. It's of the moment.
Yeah. Right. You can't help it. The medium and the paper is unforgiving. You have to be working in it.
You have to be right there. And Cezanne is the greatest. I just faint over his watercolors.
What is it about how he approaches them? Because I prefer them to the oils, in the main.
I do too. And it's what I'm talking about. It's that immediacy, just the oils are great. He fractures light. He shapes an orange, and he puts something in back of it and a fourth of it in front of it. But it's thought in a watercolor. You're thinking, but the thinking is instant, and it's very part of the whole. You can't separate it.
Yeah. It's a difference between the kind of formulaic approach to the oils. I mean, and we can say that, versus the kind of free form, indeterminacy of the watercolor.
Yeah.
Here's another one. This is one of my favorites. Paul Klee's, one of his Tunisian watercolors, where it's just diaphanous. The light, the materiality just vanishes in sort of haze in a way.
What else is interesting, Jason, is the lightness. Not the because when you start painting, you're getting heavier color, darker color, things. Watercolors tend to be lighter, and filled with light, and colors are washed on. It's
right.
And that is not supposed to be impressive, But we're not supposed to impress with a watercolor. A watercolor is something magical. Yeah.
It's interesting because in the 19th century, I just went up to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where they have a big JMW Turner show that I'm reviewing for the Rail. And Turner, the greatest artist of the first half of the 19th century, did these exhibition watercolors, these large scale watercolors, very heavily worked, and framed and shown, publicly. And but you could see that he did it for a reason, and it's exactly what you're saying, that there were light effects that he could get with the watercolor, and of course atmosphere. He's the greatest painter of atmosphere, I think, ever, that he could not get with oil, no matter how hard he tried, till he was very much older, much later in his career. And even these very fussy exhibition watercolors are transcendent.
Jason,
I encourage people to go see it.
I really, I said I didn't want to talk about these works, but I'm enjoying what you did. So thank you.
I appreciate it. I love talking to artists about, how they think and work. And, I hope people go see the show, because there are other watercolors. I just picked a few to look at here. And some of my favorites, I don't know if you're a fan of Precisionism and Charles Demuth, which couldn't seem further away from abstract expressionism. And yet, there are such commonalities between what these artists are doing, these early 20th century American artists. I love this one from Yale. I don't know if you ever saw it.
I never saw it. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's a great one. Charles Demuth. And then finally, one more comparison, if you will indulge me.
Oh my God.
Celici.
You are too much. You are too much.
So I was chagrined to see that in your terrific interview with Charles Duncan in the Rail in May 2020, that you mentioned this painting, because I read the interview after I'd already done this. Trust me, the slideshow. And a poster of this painting was in my dad's office when I was growing up in the Lawrence Township Public Schools in New Jersey. And he loved it. He's a psychologist. That seemed to make total sense. Now we're all obsessed with Stranger Things. It makes even more sense. But Celici was onto something. But formally, I love the way, in your watercolors, you're kind of working with the negative space and turning it into the formidable chromatic space. And I was just thinking maybe Celici was an impact on you, because MoMA got it right here, right then, 1943, I think.
Boy, you are amazing, amazing.
Thank you.
That painting was up for many years. Of course, now it's, what is it considered, lesser, or, it's been dismissed. People love that painting. And, I stood before it and looked at all the faces. It's a fascinating painting and should really be reevaluated and looked, but it definitely was in my psyche, and I'm amazed that you found it. Amazed.
We have like a similar background in a sense, I guess. But when I show these paintings to my students who are not corrupted by this sort of fabricated single story of modernism, they love this stuff.
Yes.
It connects totally with everything they're into.
Jason, if art is not for people, who is it for? Just these few characters? This modernism has dominated the vision, and society has been made to feel very stupid if they don't like total modernist art.
Yeah.
There was an ad that was run in the New York Times, put in by MoMA, and it showed either a Picasso or some abstract, and on the other side was a Bouguereau, and it said, which is the work of art? And if you were a stupid, unintelligent lout, you liked the Bouguereau. So you were afraid to like the Bouguereau because you really wanted to be with it. And that's how it's been corrupted,
Yeah. I'll tell you a very short story. When I curated the exhibition, Pre-Raphaelites, Victorian Avant-Garde at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., with Tim Barringer and Diane Wagner there, Roberta Smith reviewed it for the Times. Thank goodness, it gets you a lot of attention. But she literally wrote that if you like this art, you should walk down the hall to see the Manets and the Impressionist works and look closely at them, and you will see what is actual great art as opposed to this. And basically telling the readers that if you like this, you're wrong, you have a problem. Your aesthetic instincts are incorrect, which is so patronizing, right? And this is ironic because if you check her Instagram page, her image is a Rossetti portrait of Jane Morris. But I think she's come back a little bit from that now. But that was 2013, And if you were to put down your audience in that way, instead of trying to understand the concept behind the exhibition, which was, quite carefully constructed, and then try to see the value in it, then you're not really serving the public who is interested in this.
Of course, public, with photorealism, there were lines around the block. People loved it, and it still hasn't been.
Let me show us.
Yeah, it hasn't been. It has not been understood for the depth, and it's not just painting a photograph. Certainly not my work.
Right.
Anyhow.
No, so much more going on. We'll talk about that in a second, but I just want to show people the self-portrait that's in the show from 1955 to 1957, which is along with the text panel, which is not really abstract expressionism, but it's in this kind of, on your website, you call it mid-century realism, for want of a sort of better term. But that idea of, really, bucking the trend in 1955, when Johns is painting targets, when Rauschenberg is doing combines, when Philip Pearlstein is painting models, figures, right? And you are painting yourself over and over and over, really interestingly, at a moment of, sort of, I don't know, self-inquiry, but also establishing, it feels to me, a different direction for your art.
Well, I hadn't seen this in a long time, and I really wanted it in the show. Here I am, having hung around with Jackson and that whole group of guys, right? Very macho, very powerful. And even the women, Grace Hardigan was a good friend of mine, but they were tough, and they acted tough, but the men's dominated. It was a completely male dominated scene in terms of paintings had to be brutal and tough and big and, all of those. And I am finally standing here saying, wait a minute, I am me, I'm a woman, I'm a girl, I'm a painter. And it's a kind of, I wouldn't use the word defiance, you'd have to help me with another word. But I'm standing up and I'm breaking from that tradition. And none of them did. None of them did till the very end. Grace and I became very close at the end. So did Elaine and I. But they all drank, and they felt they had to behave that way in order to be accepted. So a really interesting painting that stops. And I think this was just after I had that incident with Pollock, and I said, no more.
Everyone should read about it. He came on to her at the bar, and she just gave him the Heisman, pushed him away. Get out of my face. It's a good story. I think that there's, what are we going to say? Resistance. It's a kind of swag. There's a swagger to this painting, because I look at that left arm. It reminds me of Van Dyck's portrait of Charles I standing next to his horse with the greatest left elbow foreshortened in the history of art. And then you have your right thumb sort of, hooked in your pocket here. There's a swagger. You're wearing jeans, right? And a tank top. And in your studio. And the background reminds me of a painting, which I didn't bring an image of it, but it's called Black and White Still Life for Franz Klein from the year before, 1954, as if you're sort of inserting yourself in front of that more conceptual still life composition. But I like also the fact that it looks like that's like a French door in the background or a window or something.
It's invented because it was in my tiny little Chelsea bedroom that I was so broke. I had given up my loft, and so.
Well, I feel like that also has a kind of level of symbolism, because you're still letting the world in, and I think that is a critical element in your art. You trace from the beginning that the world, you're not removed. You're removing yourself from the world, whether you're doing landscapes or the detritus of pop culture in the photorealist period. The world is a part of what you're doing, as we'll see with the rest of the images. It feels very authentic, as someone wrote in the chat. So here I have a picture of you on the right there, pontificating nicely, but just to show scale how big these things are, because I think when you see them in reproduction, you do not realize how formidable and large these paintings are in terms of scale. And I remember seeing the one I'll show next with Marilyn Monroe in a survey book when I was in undergrad, and then being surprised when I saw them finally in the flesh in the museum and how big they are. So this series from the 1970s, after you do this sort of mid-century realism period of the pop images. Maybe just explain very briefly to people who are not so familiar with them, your process in making these, your actual process.
Oh my.
If you don't mind.
Well, I at that point had become a real photographer, and I never took it seriously as photographs. They were, you know, it was a means. Richard Estes and I lived near each other, and we would talk about cameras and lenses. So I would set up a very, very complex still life. For instance, if you see the lipstick balanced on top of the skull, right? See it?
Yeah.
All right. In order to photograph that, that had to be glue, tape, whatever, you know, it had to be suspended. And that angle was very important. The sand and the wire in the hourglass had to be just at the right moment. The flame, you know, the candle was burning down and the wax was dripping. Right. So these were very intense photo sessions that somebody compared them to a Fibonacci series, but the turn of the dice, the mirror, for instance, the mirror with the skull in it, right? And there's another mirror with a rainbow, reflects the mirror on the white, and that white mirror is the white of the canvas, actually, which I'm proud of. But the cherries in front of the mirror in front of the powder puff, the powder puff in front of the crystals, and so the complexity and abstraction of this painting is enormous. Also, I'm still out of AbX. The picture plane is tilted up, and I go into all. I mean, it's not Bechtel. Bechtel, you walk in. It's not Richard. You know, you walk in. There's a car on the street. There's a floor. There's a sky. These are basically right out of AbX. Yeah. And
she's referring to Robert Bechtel, famous for his paintings of cars, subject of my first ever published review. And of course, Richard Estes painting the New York scene. So it's a very different approach in these pictures.
Yeah.
What kind of camera were you using? A large format camera and a tripod?
I got a Hasselblad. I had a Hasselblad, which added to that square format. I love the Hasselblad. Yeah. But it took maybe a year to gather all my props. Wow. That skull is very hard to get a skull as beautiful and perfect as that skull. I teach anatomy, by the way, and I also used to draw Spider-Man. Thought you might like to know that.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that. We get into the comics a little bit. Really interesting. So these are they always feel to me like curiosity shops, cabinet of curiosities, these sort of accumulation of material which has some kind of relationship to each other. But you wouldn't say this represents the way you live, although, you know, in terms of your environment.
Emmy just handed me something and said I should mention it.
Yeah.
You know, in Chuck's obit, they talk about the origin of photorealism. And they mention Richard, Chuck, and Bechtel. And I kind of thought, I felt not good about that because Bechtel lived on the West Coast. He wasn't here. And it was Chuck and Richard and I that would always talk about the airbrush, talk about cameras. Chuck and I would constantly talk about how we're gonna, I mean, I prepared my own canvas with gesso, that huge canvas, and so did Chuck. And so, you know, it's the same thing happening again because I was one of the founders, you know, and so.
Well, you're pleased to know that in the most recent edition of Arneson's History of Modern Art, when he deals with photorealism, it's Chuck, Richard, and you, and
Oh,
Malcolm Morley, strangely, but you are front and center. And this painting, Vanitas, is in there in the textbook. So
thanks for that.
we're working on it. We're gonna break all this and
Oh,
make it a much more inclusive story.
Why?
Here's Marilyn Monetas, which is the one that I first came across when I first learned about your work, 1997. No, that's not the right date. Sorry. This is from the 1970s. Apologies for the typo. And you know, I'm wondering about how you amped up the color in these works. I mean, were the photographs as sort of positively lurid as the paintings, or what was your process in tweaking them?
Well, I love intense color. You know, I mean, look at me. You know, wherever it needed it, I loved her, and I felt that men loved her, women loved her vulnerability, and again, if you start looking at all the objects, and you can read my paintings, you could read what object is in front of the other. They're very abstract. Interesting, you know, interesting things happen because the lipstick, and I start floating things, you know, but the lipstick in the mirror gets close to her mouth. Poor Meryl. And the writing on the painting is very important also.
The text here.
Your text, it's text from a Norman Mailer book, but you know, she never felt love. And she ran away from her orphanage, and she was caught in a windstorm or something and brought back. And the woman in charge of the orphanage powdered her face and said she was pretty, and maybe it was the first time she felt an inkling of love. But you know, oh, by the way, that peach pit, that came from another peach. I mean, there's such complex detail, you know. And
well, it's almost taxidermical. I mean, in the way that you're manipulating form and bringing it back to life in a sense, in all these objects, and you know, the baroqueness of this tabletop, that brilliant crimson, which is such a motif in Baroque painting. Actually, I think about Cecily Brown's been using that red tabletop in a lot of her recent paintings. She's been looking at Flemish still lifes. And then the suspended brush here, somehow sort of hovering with a shadow and then dripping.
Yeah, almost blood. You know, that purple cloth up on top, you know, at this moment, and it was a hard time in my life, and my marriage was breaking up, and it was very hard. And I was very involved in this drawing group, right, with Phil and a whole group. And several of them stopped talking to me. One, because I was using the photograph, and two, because of the purple drape. It was so ridiculous.
The purple drape.
Yeah.
Bizarre.
I was using these colors, and I was using photograph, and you could use Muybridge, but you couldn't use regular photographs. That was verboten.
It seems bizarre, obviously, to me. I mean, thinking artists always embrace technology, whether they admit it or not, and using technology to get to a point which is very different from the source photograph, obviously. I mean, not having seen it, but you couldn't imagine this as a photograph, I think, having looked at it now. I mean, it seems to do so many different things from what Estes is doing and what, you know, Philip Perlstein was doing at the time. So fast forward to post-pop Baroque, as we're getting close to time here today. What is Audrey up to now? Well, her most recent series has been these paintings, mixed media. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, because I know for a couple decades, you didn't do any large scale painting. You did sculpture, which I'm going to show one, and you did watercolors, but not large scale paintings. And this seems to be a return to painting, and comic books And I would argue this Wonder Woman is more Gal Gadot than these kinds of comic book versions, like George Perez's version here from the 1970s, which actually he just passed away. One of the great artists of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, George Perez. But this is a very different kind of depiction of Wonder Woman. And then, of course, it's overlaid with Dürer, who we were talking about before, his Melancholia 1 here on the right. So maybe talk a little bit about the gestation of this series for the last decade or so.
Yeah, in photorealism, I was involved with light, and how light hit objects, not the fender of a car or a glass window, but how it would hit a perfume bottle or crystal. And I thought there is no line in nature. Like if you hold your hand up and you do a contour line around your hand, there is no line. Your arm interrupts space. So part of my theory with photorealism was that there is no line. All of a sudden, I fall in love with line, and I'm totally in love with Dürer, who I think is the greatest comic artist that ever lived. He's just a total nutcase, and he has a ball.
Yeah.
And the woodcuts and the shading with line and the tonality that he gets. So that sort of started me. And then Melancholia, who is a kind of depressed angel, right? And in the middle, there's a sign that says Melancholia, which is from Dürer, and a bat is holding it. And the theory is if you drink bat's blood, it'll take away your depression. So here's this angel who's stuck. She's stuck, and she's contemplating. And here is Wonder Woman, the contemporary woman, who's smashing the rock. There's that wonderful Dürer rock, and comic. I just fell in love with. They've been so disrespected. And they're so talented. They're incredibly talented artists. So that's the start.
And it's a return to a kind of drawing in this most recent series of work.
Drawing, I'm still drawing. I love that line, and I love, And if you look in the Dürer and you see the density of that rock, you can't get through it. Well, here it's just being smashed and exploded.
Robert Longo did a whole show at Pace this past year around this Dürer print, and he had a sculpture in the middle of the room in the shape of this form. He had made a sculpture, and he did a beautiful charcoal dot by dot rendition of Melancholia 1, handmade charcoal dot by dot rendition. I can send you some photos from the show. Quite amazing. It's amazing. This work has such a power. So I know in reading some of your memoirs that you lived on 8th Street and 3rd Avenue, and famously there was a hole in the floor, and you could look down to the apartment below, and the person who lived there was an artist who worked for Marvel Comics, but it never says who it was. Do you remember the name?
Yes, Robert Lander, Lander, and he inked.
Okay.
He was an inker, so he would get the work in pencil. And he inked it.
Okay. And he would get it from other artists, and then he would do the inking at home.
I guess he got it from Marvel or whatever.
Yeah. And you did some issues?
Well, when he was very busy, I would do some of the inking.
Okay, but it's not. You were never credited.
No.
It's so typical, right?
These
systems. I hope he paid you something. But I did look in the Grand Comics database and I couldn't find you. So I'm trying to try to figure out what issues there were. So, cartooning. I mean, I think it's wonderful to think of Dürer as a cartoonist. And I don't think he would reject the title. It simply means a kind of acuity of line And, I think because the subject matter is so weighty, right? These biblical stories and the New Testament and the passion, that we can't think of it as cartooning. But I don't know how else you talk about someone like Crivelli. I know this is a painting which had a great effect on you at the Met. What do you still see in this work that is deeply appealing? I know we don't have all day, but let's just your basic impressions.
He's like the love of my life. And there were two artists that I felt I had to really redeem. And one of them was Crivelli. I wrote an article on Crivelli maybe 30, 40 years ago, which just it was published, but there's a Crivelli show in Birmingham, England now.
Oh.
At the Icon Museum.
Okay.
Two of my paintings are in it. But
oh, wow, I didn't know.
He is also another artist that has been sidetracked, defamed, criticized. Yep. He is one of the greatest artists that ever lived in the world. And,
I agree.
How could this be? So the director of the, what's his name? Jonathan Watkins felt the same way about Crivelli and came across my article, which is now published in the catalog of this show. Which
terrific.
But I went to the National Gallery in England, and there was incredible Crivelli hanging.
Yep.
And that was years ago. And I said, my God, maybe because you couldn't find a reproduction of his work anywhere. And I bought, the catalog was a skinny little folder written by, I think, Martin Davies, director of the museum. The first sentence says, Crivelli wasn't a very good artist. And he goes on to put him down. And well, that prompted me, but he's an amazing, he's called decorative, and he's not in fashion, and maybe he should be more, I can't go, I will go on and on and on, and I won't, but no, I love Crivelli. Everybody's got to go to the Met and see this on the second floor.
Yeah, it's a classic. And, it's interesting you're talking about the National Gallery in London, because also the Pre-Raphaelites in England were the ones who sort of stimulated the interest in this kind of art, because this was considered the primitives, Italian primitives, the second tier kind of work. And Crivelli, how can you be painting this when Botticelli is painting Primavera, right? That kind of idea, this seems retardataire.
Jason, I don't understand that thinking. Could you explain it? How could they call this primitive?
Well, it's because it doesn't lead to where they want to go. So it doesn't lead to Leonardo. It doesn't presage sfumato. It's too direct. It's also related to the kind of thing that you also love, which is Spanish Baroque sculpture, Catholic art, card-carrying Catholic, colored polychrome sculpture, which especially in England was a no-go, right? In Anglican England, you couldn't have that kind of representation. So this stuff was always kind of tamped down until, of course, this is always the case, the market was too hot for Raphael and Giorgione and Titian, blah, blah, blah. So the galleries and the dealers start to sell this stuff because they could find it. They could get a hold of it. So the market's kind of part of it, but also the Pre-Raphaelites were into this because it is authentic. It has real emotion, and it's done with such a level of feeling in the drawing and the coloration.
It's also linear.
Yeah. Not painterly.
Very
not painterly.
Well, it's painterly, but not in the sfumato and mixing.
Right. Not in the Veronese sense.
I used to stand there and look at her hair. He paints every strand.
Yeah.
So it's very linear, and I love that linear aspect of it.
Yeah, we can see that in your drawings. So I wanted to plug a comic book artist, Barry Windsor Smith, the greatest graphic novel, I think, of all time, which I reviewed in the Rail. It's called Monsters. And if you're interested in linearity, if you're interested in drawing, pen and ink work, chiaroscuro, this is it. This is one page here on the right. He's drawing wicker he's drawing spider webs seen before a face, and both in white, negative, and also positive, black. And it all has to do with emotional meaning and clarity in the story. So anyone who's interested in cartooning illustration, Barry Windsor Smith's Monsters, 364 pages. And it took him 30 years to do it. And I taught a class on this past term with my Exploring the Visual Arts class, and they all had to present on a section of it. And it was the best class of the year. They were totally into it, and they don't see this as kitsch at all. They kind of fully understood it as a fully formed work of literature, visual literature, I would say. That's my plug. But there are artists who are doing brilliant work, Crivelli level. Here's one of the most spectacular of these pop Baroque paintings by Audrey Flack. And you can see here this extraordinary picture, which was in the Hollis Taggart Show 2017, which is a mashup of toys and gold nuggets raining from the sky, Durer's Horsemen of the Apocalypse. This figure from a comic book, I couldn't figure out who it is. You can enlighten us if you would. Sinking Ship. And here is the cover of the Rail from which I mentioned, where there's a terrific interview with Audrey from May of 2020. And here is the Durer, if you don't know it, which is one of the many references in this painting. But what is this character, this figure, this woman sort of coming out of the sea from?
Well, it's called Days of Reckoning. I was going to call it the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, but
yeah,
I started it long before the pandemic, before the fires, and during the painting of it, my husband got sick, and things. So the painting took longer than it should, but it was good because it needed time to bake, and things started to go in. But if you look up in the left-hand corner where that little pink fat girl holding a can of Coke, and it says crack.
New Coke. Yeah.
Yeah.
It says crack. Yeah.
Crack and Coke. I mean, what's Coke? And and then these the little children. There's two little children there. They're terrified. There's the clergy being eaten by a demon. She is and the main horseman is holding those scales and dripping some kind of acid green contamination. Yeah,
looks like contaminated green sludge, like from a Nickelodeon show. Yeah, and then all these other things, earth exploding. There's an environmental element to this painting.
The poor little boy, he's holding on to a raindrop, like it's gonna save him, right?
Yeah.
All my connections are okay. And she's coming out of the Guggenheim. However, the painting goes from dark over to light. And there's hope. And there's what I find interesting, Jason, is that there's a lot of, we talked about this heavy paint, thick, viscous, a lot of an artist I'm showing with, this painting is in Leipzig right now on a show with Gainey, who's a very wonderful artist, but his work is very dark and viscous and exposed, bloody limbs. And I just thought, my God, I'm using light color. There's a lightness, even though the subject is very serious. And I thought, what the hell am I doing? And that's what's happening now. How do you counteract the horror of what's going on? And if you keep going into it, I feel you're just going to get deeper and deeper and deeper into it. So art has to offer some other way to deal with the horror show that we're living through.
Yeah.
And not just fantasy, but maybe through color, through light, through ideas, instead of intensifying the depth of the darkness. That's all.
That's it. And what are you using here for the colors, just in terms of the medium?
Acrylic, and I have
acrylic. Okay.
Yeah, and I have some instrument that I can draw with an acrylic pen.
Huh. Okay. So there's no watercolor or colored pencils or.
No, and I
Gotcha.
What?
Glitter.
What?
Glitter.
Oh, glitter. Yeah, there's glitter.
Yeah. Glitter, the bane of all parents. Glitter, it gets everywhere. If you're using it, in these paintings to give them some substance.
Comic book artists, by the way, I used to do in the days of black and white photographs, I had a tinting kit, and I used to tint, color the photographs. And comic book artists use tints and wash over their drawings. So there's a lot of that here.
Right, fantastic. I love this series, and as I understand, you're still doing them every day. You're continue to work on these.
I really want you to see my whole Jesus series.
Yeah, we got to see that new stuff. All right, so next time, here's a fastball or a curveball, maybe. The Augustus St. Gaudens General William Tecumseh Sherman Monument, which is right outside the plaza at the southeast corner of Central Park. And I noted that you were awarded the Cooper Union Augustus St. Gaudens Medal. You have a sort of consistency with this. And why am I putting it up there? It's this gilded, fabulous monument with Sherman, who marched to the sea and helped to win the Civil War for the good guys in the North. And then here on the left, you have this figure of Victory holding the palm frond and reaching out, who was posed by Harriet Eugenia Anderson, who was a Black model from Georgia. It's a really interesting story that he was using in this sculpture. But I wanted to use this as an entry into talking just for a minute to show you people the sculpture that you've been doing for decades now, and that I was not super familiar with, but I think is really, really fascinating in consideration of a lot of interesting new figural sculpture, which is going on today. So I just chose this one, Bella Apollonia from 2001, which seems to have, a kind of superficial resemblance to this kind of pose. Although I don't know if you're thinking about this particular monument, but of course she has a palette here dripping with colors and holding paintbrushes in this outstretched hand. Are you still doing any public sculpture, Audrey?
I don't want to do public sculpture anymore, but I am sculpting constantly. It's okay. Actually, there's one Galatea in the show that's, I think it's in the project room. It's
in the back, absolutely.
Yeah, but these are that's another thing, Jason. The sculptors like Alfred Gilbert, and they're called new sculptors. They were great sculptors that were knocked out by Rodin.
Right.
And modernism.
Right.
They're some of the greatest sculptors that ever lived, and I love them. And I was very influenced by them.
Yeah, she's talking about Victorian sculptors like Alfred Gilbert, Lord Leighton, Frederick Leighton did sculpture. I mean, this sort of tradition of figural sculpture, which was pushed aside by Rodin and Camille Claudel. And, look at the Rodins now, and they seem so kind of sticky sweet to me. And these are these have such presence, the works that you're doing. And also, of course, they're tinted, they're colored, which is sort of a radical gesture. I just saw Shazia Sikander this morning, and of course she's been doing some tinted sculpture as well, and that seems to be a vital new trend. I mean, that's one way to reinvigorate this form.
40 years now.
For 40 years, I know. I'm really fascinated by it, and something's gestating in my mind to do something about this. But I hope you, an ancient, right? We know that Greek and Roman statues were painted, but of course in modernism, they were not. Polychromy is out. Polychromy is no good pure marble or bronze. That's it. Thank you, GE. I'm going to end up and then open it up to questions. Okay. But I thought you would appreciate this in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, because right now, for the first time ever, there is a really intense dialogue in the 19th century European galleries about realism. And we've never had the opportunity to do this because the Met has never had a great Pre-Raphaelite painting on view. And as someone who is an expert in this and a fan of John Everett Millais, it's thrilling to me to go in the gallery and see this juxtaposition. Courbet on the left, John Everett Millais in the next room. They're absolutely contemporary paintings, Young Ladies of the Village, 1851 to 52, and Millais' Ferdinand lured by Ariel, 1849 to 50. So for the first time, you can really put these two schools in the smaller realm of European art sort of head to head. And I've been doing experiments with my poor students and bringing them in there and letting them sort of feel their way around and gauging their reaction. And it will not surprise you to know that the muddy, thick, sedate Courbet that's overly large on the left is not as interesting to these students as this extraordinary interpretation of Shakespeare's Tempest on the right, which sort of connects both with contemporary sensibilities and the sensibilities of Victorians in 1849, 50. So that's a little long-winded way to say, you know, what I think what you're doing and what I'm really interested in art, you know, since basically the Second World War, is the artists who have sort of bucked that trend and are working in a vein which is closer to the strands related to Pre-Raphaelites through Surrealism, American early modernism, figuration, etc., than the kind of story that we've been sort of spoon-fed forever, that Courbet is the origin of modern art, via who then begat Manet, who begat Monet, who begat, I can go on in a biblical sense, Gauguin and Van Gogh and Cezanne, who begat Picasso and Braque, yada, yada, yada. That story is no longer the one tale. And we have a kind of openness of mind in a young generation who's interested in this, and thus should be really interested in your art, I would argue.
You are a very important voice to help change the old guard, because it's so clear. Why do they like that kind of brown, muddy? What is it? Is it just proper? What is it?
Well, did you know Linda Nochlin well? She was my advisor at the Institute.
I knew her. I didn't know
You knew her, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, she was my advisor. She's your neighbor on the Upper West Side before her death. You know, for her, Courbet, she was trying to find a way to understand how a brushstroke can be political. I understand that he was trying to be an apostle of realism, to elevate the working class in his mind, and to use style, brushwork, and formal qualities to convey a sense of essentially, you know, proto-socialism. That was her project. And then that got turned into something quite apolitical when you get to you know, modernism. But there's a politics in what Millais is doing also, which we don't have time to get into now, and which until, you know, the present, I don't think has been really considered in the same way. So these are open questions, but, you know, I think that as we go through and we're talking about artists like yourself or Alice Neal, who I know you also you knew, and there's her portrait of Linda Nochlin on the right. Alice
and I live 3 blocks from each other, and there's a funny Alice story which I'll tell you another time.
Oh, you can't share it with the public. I mean, the response to this show was so extraordinary, right? And here is an artist who is doing figuration all the way through. You know, we're open to it.
That she wasn't the only one. This was going.
That's what I'm saying. The moment is right. The moment is right for all these reconsiderations.
Hollis is thinking of a you know, maybe you could think of another title, but mid-century realism show, which would.
Yeah, I think we need to put our heads together about that, because it's not really realism. It's something else. It's something quite different. And realism is associated, because of Courbet, with the working class, which is not how you're thinking about it or we're thinking about. But anyway, just these images are from the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Alice Neal show, which got this rapturous reception. But yeah, I think we need a wholesale reconsideration of this entire period. And it is happening. It is happening, not just in terms of subject matter, but of course, in terms of the people who were present and working in it. And I think you're front and center. Being at front and center, if you want to learn more about Audrey Flack, here you can get her book, which dates back to 1986, and now she's working on a kind of updated memoir, but Art and Soul Notes on Creating. And then on the right is a film from 2019, Queen of Hearts, which is also available, which is a documentary about your life and work. So Audrey, thank you so much for this conversation today. I deeply appreciate it. It's wonderful to meet you online, and I look forward to meeting you in person. And everyone get down to Hollis-Taggart if you can and see the works in the show Force of Nature up through June 24th, unless it's extended. You never know. But anyway, thank you so much for giving up your time. And I look forward to hearing you respond to some of the questions from the audience. I really appreciate it, Audrey.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you for doing what you're doing. You're really doing important stuff.
We're trying. I appreciate it. So I'll turn it over to Carolyn and let you take the controls for.
Thank you both so much. There's comments in the chat saying there needs to be a second hour, so we could definitely hear so much more from you both. I'd love to turn it over to Jill Easterman, or if you're able to unmute, or I can ask. Are you on the phone on your behalf?
Should I mute?
No, I'm just I'm unmuting Jill.
Thank you.
Great. Yes, we can hear you. Yeah, if you wanted to ask.
Well, I asked a number of questions and I forget kind of what they were, but I think one of them was about, what you're working on now. You work in so many different kind of expressive areas, and I guess what are you working on now, and how are you moving forward? What are your next steps that you feel you still have to contribute?
I'm very excited about a new group that I'm working on, and it is post-pop Baroque, leaning heavily towards Spanish Baroque. And like there's one painting of a very dramatic head of Jesus with a gold frame, ornate, with a kind of Jewish tabernacle on top, and a quote from John Lennon from Imagine, right? And do you have it? So, I mean, and the painting is called Imagine. And Sevi's gonna get it. I'm sure you all know the song.
Work in progress.
Oh, it's a work in progress. I don't know, can you see it?
Yeah.
It says, imagine no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us is only sky. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No greed or hunger. A brotherhood of man. Imagine no countries. It is not hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. So it's the kind of spiritual, hey, we're all in it together. There's only one way out, and I am a Jewish person. I was born Jewish, secular Jew, but so was Jesus, and so was Mary, so was all of the disciples. And while it's known, it's not accepted by the Jews or the Christians, really. And part of what I'm doing or trying to do is to just spread the whole thing out, you know, bring us all together. John Lennon was a genius. I mean, I think that was, so it's a beautiful little painting that's very touching, very soulful. I've got a Moses, I've got Jesus, and I've got me in the middle holding a Sacred Heart. So that's what's happening. A lot of that is happening. Then it's just going on and on. Can't stop. Can't stop.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you, Jill, for that question. Thank you so much. Let's see, I'll turn it over to GE. You should be able to unmute.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Jason, as always. And Audrey, such a pleasure. Thank you for spending some time with us. My question was, I've always been fascinated about how music played a part in your coming to your creating, especially the story of you making a paper piano and all of that, and also as a parallel way of making. And could you please talk a little bit about Audrey Flack and the history of art string band? And how you wrote songs about artists like Pollock and Craster and Picasso and Caravaggio?
Well, you know about that. I wish the band was around. You know, we were really, I would just write these songs. And I think about it now, it's probably, we were a really radical feminist band. And exposing and funny. I had some really great musicians. There is a CD, I have a few of them left. And every time we performed, we would just knock the audience out because we were funny too. We were very good. You know, actually they want us to come to Birmingham, but you know, bands disperse. I don't know how you live without music. I still play. I've got my banjo in the studio, but I'm very involved with the ukulele. So it's a tiny little instrument, but it can be a very serious, anyhow, can't live without music. And some of my sculpture, I have wanted to exhibit. Well, for instance, if you go into a church and you see a Bernini or a sculpture, you've got organ music, you've got incense, you've got colored light, you know, so I've been thinking about that. But listen, hell, I'm 91. I don't know how long I've got to do any of these ideas that I have. But it would be nice.
I look forward to hearing it sometime. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, we definitely all look forward to that. Thank you, GE. Next, I'd love to turn it over to Raven. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Hello.
Hi, Raven.
Hi. So my question is, I wanted to know, back when you were just starting to take yourself seriously as an artist, what advice you would give to yourself before starting your journey? It's kind of a deeper, like, I don't know, kind of question.
You know, Raven, I sort of couldn't help it. You know, it was like a calling. I don't think I could have gotten through, you know, my life went through some really rough times where at a period I didn't even want to live anymore because it got so bad. And I don't think I could have survived without art, without the old masters and the old mistresses who were like family to me, who I went to for nourishment. And I think certainly in those days, not, I mean, now it's become a big commodity, but it's like I was born to it, calling. I didn't have to say anything to myself. I just couldn't not do it. And I still can't not do it. You know, even if I'm kind of feeling a little weak these days because I've had some medical issues, I get up in the morning and I do a little work and I feel better. So I don't know.
I mean, We know your parents were not artists. Your dad made, clothing, dresses. But did you have like seminal experience in the public schools with art instruction? Was that something that lit a fire in you?
Oh, what happened is I was very hyperactive, which I still am, and I couldn't sit still. And I went to a very strict school where you had to sit with your, public school. And I was being called out. I was bad because I was a giggler and I was a talker and I was like, I just hyper. And so they threw me out of class. And one teacher had a little pity on me and gave me a big piece of paper and pencil. And I started to draw. And I was a class artist in kindergarten already. And that's, but instruction, no. And in a terrible junior high school, but music and art was great.
Yeah, your high school.
Yeah. And life kind of does things. There was some kid told me about music and art. My mother was very creative, but there were immigrants, and a girl should get married. Too much education is not right. But do you know Margie Ponce Israel? Margie Israel was married to Marvin Israel, who was the lover of Diana Arbus. And Margie was my childhood friend. And Margie told me about Cooper Union. So, life brings things in your path and you choose it or you don't.
Beautiful. Thank you, Raven, for that question. And thanks, Audrey, for such a wonderful answer. It is, I know everybody could ask you a million more questions, but we don't want to take all of your time up today. And we do have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. Today, I'm really thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Elizabeth Lothian, to the stage. Elizabeth Lothian is the social media manager here at the Brooklyn Rail and an assistant editor at Guernica. Her work has appeared in Book Forum, Lit Hub, Electric Literature, and elsewhere. She holds an MFA in nonfiction from the New School, where she was a creative writing fellow. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you so much, Audrey. I'm in the Rails office right now, and we've really enjoyed listening to your conversation today. Thank you, Jason, as always. Today, I'm going to be reading two poems. The first is from Ada Limone's collection, The Carrying, and the poem is titled Instructions on Not Giving Up. More than the fuchsia funnels breaking out of the crab apple tree, more than the neighbor's almost obscene display of cherry limbs shoving their cotton candy-colored blossoms to the slate sky of spring rains. It's the greening of the trees that really gets to me. When all the shock of white and taffy, the world's baubles and trinkets, leave the pavement strewn with the confetti of aftermath, the leaves come. Patient, plodding, a green skin growing over whatever winter did to us. A return to the strange idea of continuous living despite the mess of us, the hurt, the empty. Fine then, I'll take it, the tree seems to say. A new slick leaf unfurling like a fist to an open palm. I'll take it. And the second poem I'm going to read is from another brilliant collection, Mary Ruefle's Dunce. And the title of this poem is Cracker Bell. I grew up. I became myself and was haunted by it. And I loved to wander, utterly alone, listening to the sound of tears, striving to guess my own secret, and racking my imagination for a dream. Meanwhile, Everybody else knew my story, and there was not one of them who would give me so much as a bird dropping. So on I wandered, with arms and nitric startled eyes, nitpicking my way through the world, when the electrical current that runs in all directions, deep beneath the earth, shook me. And at once I felt, there are so many years to fail, that to fail them all, one by one, would give me a double life, and I took it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Elizabeth. That's amazing. Yeah, speechless. Thank you so much, Audrey and Jason, for such an incredible conversation. We would also like to thank Severin again, and Karen, everyone from Hollis, Everett, for making today happen. Over the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has brought together art, music, dance, film, theater, literature, and thoughtful social and political meditations in our monthly publication and in our public events, like here in our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support our writers, editors, and operations here at the Rail. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. if you're free for a conversation on Carmen Herrera's show at Luzon, featuring Tony Bachara, Odile Donald Odita, Monica Espinal. And we will conclude with a poetry reading by Ty Cooper. And you can turn your microphones on, say goodbye, hello, goodbye as you leave. Thank you all so much again for today.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank
Great.
you all.
Thanks, Jason.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Audrey.
Thank you,
Audrey.
everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Elizabeth.
Carolyn. Thank you, Elizabeth.
And thanks for the roofle.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Audrey. Thank you, Nick, for agreeing to put this all together when I suggested it like 5 months ago. We've been thinking about, Audrey, we've been thinking about this for a long time, and Nick really made it happen. And I'm deeply appreciative and miss you, buddy. Good luck. Good luck.
Thank you.
All your hands on there.
And thank my mom and dad are there causing trouble somewhere in there in the mix. But Audrey, thank you so much, and I look forward to more conversations with you.
Hey.
Christmas, you are.
Everybody have a great day. Bye now.
So much, Audrey.